The moment that you say, look, this isn't new, there's nothing new about it. It's exactly what always happens, is that people who want to control everyone, they talk about the peace and prosperity that's going to come when everybody gives up their weapons, gives up their borders, gives up their independence, their own traditions, their own identity. They say, stop all that fighting. Just stop it. Stop. There shouldn't be any more war. And everybody says, oh, that makes sense. Let's have no more war. But they don't add, let's not have any more war because you're not going to be free to fight for anything because we're going to be in charge and we'll make all the decisions.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sit Down, but before we get to the interview, we'd love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review because we love your feedback. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works and how to affect real change. Without further ado, here's the interview. Yoram Hazony, welcome to the Signal Sit Down.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, and it's good seeing you here in the United States. We're happy to have you here, and we're really looking forward to the next National Conservatism Conference, and we will be covering that and talking about that, I think, a whole lot more in the months to come. But today, we have to talk about your book, The Virtue of Nationalism, which is coming out for a second edition. It was a very formative book in my upbringing. 2018 it comes out, if I remember correctly.
Right. Yep.
At the time, I'm a student at the University of California, Berkeley, trying to make sense of the MAGA movement, which I had embraced. And there were several of these kind of books. Hillbilly Elegy from JD Vance explaining the kind of populist roots. Your book explaining the nationalist roots. And you took a big bite out of the apple because for the last 80 years, everybody has been saying that the boogeymen of the 20th century, they were all nationalists. Nationalism was the source of our ills, and really the entire post-war order on its face appeared to be built around the idea that nationalism was bad. And here you are with a book in 2018 titled The Virtue of Nationalism. First, I think we should define some terms. So, nationalism, what is it?
Nationalism is, wait for it, it's a theory of political order, which asserts or takes the position that the world is governed best when it's constituted by many independent nations. Okay, so nationalism is naturally, it's opposed to imperialism. An imperialist theory is a theory that says best to have one world government, or at least, one government that's as broad as possible. And for all of human history, we've encountered rulers and gods that have asserted the best thing is to bring peace and prosperity to the world, end wars by conquering everybody and imposing order from an imperial center. And the nationalist theory is the opposite theory. It's a theory that says, no, actually, without diversity of human governments, traditions, independent nations that can chart their own course, mankind ends up getting stifled. And so the only real route to freedom on this theory is through independent nations.
So we'll get into the virtues of nationalism. I love the nationalism imperialism dichotomy. We'll drill down into that in just a second. But when you came out with this first edition, Brexit, Trump won, right? Those were, I guess, the big flashpoints so far that this liberal international order, the uniparty regime, the however you want to label the globalist elites, however you want to label this form of government, this mode of government, it was being rejected by people in their home countries when they had the opportunity to reject it. What did you see back then? Because it seems like a lot of a lot of the book focuses in a way on the, United Nations EU apparatus that we found ourselves in 2018. What do you think about that situation then? And as we come out with this second edition, how has that game changed, in your opinion?
Well, I think you've put your finger on it. In 2018, the situation was that the word nationalism, not just the word nationalism, but the very idea that the country like Britain could break away from international institutions like the EU and reassert its independence. The very idea of that was received by a tremendous number of people as being like a throwback to like an evil age, like some kind of primitive eruption of emotionalism and irrationality. And really, I think there have been people who were, globalists or liberal internationalists for a very long time. I mean, this is an idea that Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt were wrangling about it, and Cabot Lodge more than 100 years ago. So in a sense, it's an old story. But it wasn't until after the fall of the Berlin Wall, until 1989, that all of these sort of pent-up utopian fantasies burst out onto the scene with a shocking degree of aggressiveness and vigor. Before 1989, I mean, the Reagan years, people were completely preoccupied with the struggle against communism, and nobody talked about global governance and eliminating institutions, eliminating borders, eliminating nation states. In those days, John Lennon, imagined a world with no borders, no religions, nothing to fight or die for. That was still mostly ridiculed. People hummed the tune, but as a political idea, it had no traction, almost. And then after 1989, suddenly that changed. Suddenly you get, George H.W. Bush, who's supposed to be like a hard-headed realist and all this.
Yeah, wins the primary because McCain was more hawkish than him in a way.
Right. So here he is, and he uncorks this slogan of the new world order, where he explained the new world order is, for hundreds of generations we've been waiting for this moment to eliminate the law of the jungle and replace it by the rule of law. So from that moment where he starts talking about we're going to wrap the entire planet in this single rule of law, all of a sudden, no one was allowed to object to it. Margaret Thatcher, in 1989, in her famous Bruges speech, she said clearly, this is crazy. Where are we going? So her party got rid of her, and the same thing with like Irving Kristol, Jeane Kirkpatrick, people who said, why are we doing this? And they all got sort of ushered off the stage quickly. Mm-hmm. And then for an entire generation, we're left with Democrats and Republicans, Labor and Tories, Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, everybody, all the major parties across the democratic Western world, just sort of accepting that, we're going to eliminate all the borders. Charles Crowder Hammer wrote an essay called Universal Dominion, about, like it's time to put an end to sovereignty. And so by the time you get to 2016, to Brexit and to Donald Trump running for president, it's strange to say, but people thought that you were crazy or primitive or fascist or mentally ill or something if you stood for the idea that your country should be independent from other countries, and that democracy should lead to your own traditions, your own values, your own interests being represented, and each country would go its own way according to its own lights. Mm-hmm. So that was when the book first came out, it came out into into this, almost chaos and hysteria among the elites. I mean, it was shocking that both in Britain and in the U.S. there was this hysteria, like the world was ending, the sky was falling over this idea of national independence. Now it's 7 years later, and for sure things have changed. I mean, there's no doubt that my book and several others helped to create, a point of view that you could say was rooted, was based in something.
Yeah. You created a safe space for the nationalists to take up the mantle.
That's really what it is, because until my book and a few others, there were other key books. There was Richard Legutko's a book, Rusty Reno, Orrin Cass. There were a number of key texts that created the philosophical and historical framework. But what these books did was they took something that a lot of people thought, how can national independence be something evil and fascist and crazy? So they had these gut feelings, and supporting Trump for a lot of people was intuitive. For many others, they were just hesitating because he was just getting nailed with so much venom, and having these books, what it did, I think, was first and foremost to allow people to read something that was sensible, calm, footnoted, serious, went into the history, showed what the precedents were, took on the opposing ideas, and it gave people the ability to say, all right, I'm not being stupid about this. This isn't just some kind of dumb thing. This is an argument that's been going on for hundreds, actually thousands of years.
Right. And I might have had this pre-rational impulse, and here I am reading a book that it actually explains why, to a certain degree, I'm having those emotions. I'm having these gut feelings. Yeah. You raise a lot of really good points, because I misspoke earlier when you mentioned George H.W. in the New World Order. I said, oh yeah, George W., he won the primary because of McCain. And I think a lot of people who take my age, who take a kind of short view of history when it comes to Trumpism, now into its 10th year, more than a decade removed from the golden escalator, is we see the Bush years. There's a conservative revolt about the George W. Bush years, and a conservative populist revolt from the Obama years. And those two revolts kind of combine, and out comes Trumpism, MAGA, the America First movement. It's really important to realize this wasn't this slow mission creep drip necessarily through the 90s. It's the Berlin Wall fell, and it was a lot of, as you said, latent, pent-up, utopian views that kind of instantly burst into the floor. And it's by reaching back to those pivotal years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, you can really see how Lincoln likes to use the word tending, how things are tending, how the world was tending towards this really entrenched global system that, for conservatives who have a conservative view of human nature, that was kind of begging for a backlash like this. You can label it populist, you can label it nationalist, you can label it a bevy of different things. But I think one of the interesting points that you raise in the book time and time again, and the kind of central dichotomy of the book, is nationalism versus imperialism. And you spoke briefly to what imperialism is, its motivations, but you don't use the word globalism a lot. Globalism as a subset of imperialism maybe is a good way to put it. What is imperial about globalism? How does it fit into the imperialist frameworks, which you can trace back all the way to ancient history?
Yeah. Well, I don't use the word globalism so much for a very simple reason, which is that the globalists pick this word. In fact, they have a whole vocabulary of words that are designed to they're all euphemisms to kind of obscure what it is that they're doing. So yes, they'll use globalism instead of empire. They'll use governance instead of government. As though there's like some new thing that they're inventing, and that global governance is going to be something different from global government, and and endless terms like this: pooled sovereignty, rules-based international order, community of nations, openness. I mean, there's dozens of these terms which came into fashion after 1989, after the sudden shift in the direction of utopianism by almost all the political parties, and I think for our understanding of history and human nature, it's really worth focusing on what happened there. 1989, is the fall of the Berlin Wall. We didn't know for sure that the Soviet Union was going to collapse, for another year or two. I mean, it was clear that it was coming, but by 1990, that first George H.W. Bush administration, he already had New World Order and this concept of the world under a single rule of law in 1990. All right, it's a year after the fall, and already all these forces around him have jumped to say, well, now there's going to be a new thing. Now we're going to eliminate barriers. It's it's going to be a free trade world, and everybody's going to move towards liberal democracies. The reason that imperialism strikes such a sharp note, the reason that the book hurt people, it caused damage to the existing euphemism systems, is because by saying, no, it's not governance, it's government that you're developing. No, it's not globalism, it's just another empire. It's just a repeat of all our historical previous examples with it. That allowed people to suddenly wake up. I mean, there really were a lot of people who, the moment that you pointed out this peace and prosperity thing, like that we're going to bring peace and prosperity to the whole planet, the moment you point out that every major empire in the history of the human race, as far as we know, has made that same claim, and therefore, the globalists are not. Their whole claim was, we're doing something new that's never been done before. And people go, oh, well, it's new, so how am I supposed to react? I don't know how I'm supposed to react. The moment that you say, look, this isn't new, there's nothing new about it. It's exactly what always happens, is that people who want to control everyone, they talk about the peace and prosperity that's going to come when everybody gives up their weapons, gives up their borders, gives up their independence, their own traditions, their own identity. They say, stop all that fighting. Just stop it. Stop. There shouldn't be any more war. And everybody says, oh, that makes sense. Let's have no more war. But they don't add, let's not have any more war because you're not going to be free to fight for anything because we're going to be in charge and we'll make all the decisions. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's the reason that the book turns imperialism into kind of like a pointed instrument, and people reacted like, my gosh, this is actually what's going on, and when we look at it now, 7 years later, it's much clearer than it was in 2018, because as the nationalist, the pro-independence movement in America and Britain and Europe and other countries, as it's gained steam and it's become more and more successful, and it keeps getting stronger and stronger, and politics in all these countries are rearranging themselves, imperialists versus globalists. And as that's going on, the the old, the friendly face of globalism has just gotten uglier and uglier. It was when they felt unchallenged, then they could put on a show of how nice they were. As soon as it turns out that there are people who don't want to go in that direction and that they're not just going away, that they're organized, that they can win elections, that they can publish serious books and have real debates, as soon as that began to become clear, the left became more and more aggressive, more and more vicious. And the globalism, which was supposed to be, liberal. It was supposed to be like, this is like, Karl Popper and Friedrich Hayek and John Stuart Mill, like all of these like nice free liberty kind of things were being associated with it. As soon as it turned out that this is actually a two-party contest and they weren't just going to get the whole globe without being challenged, then it started getting ugly, like really ugly.
Because they thought they had a brilliant Foucaultian linguistic frame, right, to just push everything down. In layman's terms, word games. They're really good at playing word games, and when that rhetorical frame broke, as you mentioned, it feels like it was irreparable damage to what they were trying to pursue. And this is what makes, I think, globalism as a subset or a type of imperialist impulse very interesting, is that the framing is genius because it's really easy, particularly when people are younger, to talk about globalism and to point to the virtues of globalism. You can make everything sound very virtue-oriented, lack of conflict, lack of public lying and disinformation. Of course, we know that comes at the expense of mass surveillance and hate speech laws, but don't worry about that at the time. Focus on these virtues of globalism, and I think that's why they thought it was such a magical way of framing imperialism. But if we were to zoom back out from globalism, imperialism generally, and we'll get into the virtues of nationalism itself, but are there virtues of imperialism? Are there certain aspects of imperialism that are beneficial to a kind of nationalist order that we're talking about? Are they fully diametrically opposed? Because let's say I took up the contra Yoram Hazony point and said, well, sure, you have George H.W. Bush talking about a new world order, but let's look what happens after the Soviet Union. We have a bunch of nation states that crop up. And some of these nation states have had a far worse go of it than others. Absolutely, that's for sure. But some of them have had some successes. Some of them, with their current territorial arrangements, with their governmental arrangements, seems like they fit more into a nationalist order than an imperial order, even with our elites talking about globalism nonstop on the back burner.
Well, there are virtues that are proposed and endorsed by imperialists going back to biblical times and Alexander and the Roman Empire, and they kind of, whatever virtues there are to imperialism, they wear them out on their sleeve. Like, I mean, they don't leave anybody guessing. They say clearly, we're going to end wars. The reason that we're doing this, the reason that we are coming to take away your homeland and your patrimony and to cause you to be a citizen of the world instead of a citizen of your nation. The reason we're doing that is to bring peace, to bring economic prosperity, which comes with peace. People are not going to spend their resources on fighting wars. Fighting wars forever has meant destroying economies. It's meant causing famine, harming food supplies, causing famine, and then from that, rampant disease. I mean, all of these horrific things were associated with warfare then as now. And so the virtue of empire is to take away the excuses for peoples to fight one another to the extent that that's possible. we in the West, we've inherited, together with that set of, imperial virtues that have been handed down, Virgil and Dante and all the rest. We also have the opposite. And of course, you're right that political theorists, their job is to make things clear by artificially sharpening the distinction, the opposition, the theoretical opposition between nationalism and imperialism. Obviously, there's all sorts of things in the middle. It's just that we understand what's going on better when we can use that dichotomy. It's actually a trichotomy, because there's also anarchical societies, which are families, tribes, and nations without central government at all, and that actually has existed many, many times in places.
And I'm glad you bring up the anarchical point, the trichotomy, because as you're trying to balance these different factors, there's a lot of talks about giving a state to the Kurds. What are the Scottish going to do? The Catalonians, do they deserve their own state? Like, what are the limits on a nationalistic arrangement? What are the limits? Does everybody get their own state? I pick on Estonia a lot.
Yeah.
Particularly because I wrote a piece about how Estonia was calling for a no-fly zone at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and I pointed out the simple fact that they have 6 airplanes in their air force, and one of them is a fighter jet, and that is a training fighter jet.
Right.
And their air force in total, I believe, is under 2,000 people. So Estonia, if you're going to call for a no-fly zone, well, you ought to be able to back that up on your own. And this drew the ire of a former president of Estonia on Twitter. He was like tweeting out that I was a C- foreign relations student at some nowhere university. It was pretty great. And I got a lot of pleasure out of that Twitter interaction, but it did kind of put into my mind this idea of like, what is a nation itself? How do we define a nation itself? Are all nations entitled to territory? Right. When they don't have that type of capacity? The limits on the nation-state order itself, what do you think those limits are?
Well, that's a great...
At least one fighter jet?
Look, that's a great question. You can't... Look, I don't present nationalism as a utopian theory. Mm-hmm. Okay, meaning my argument is with liberals and Marxists, and in both cases, both the liberals and the Marxists, my objection to them is that they're very far from understanding anything about human nature. In fact, their theories are to a very large degree based on purposely not understanding human nature and providing a theory that's going to say, well, human beings are going to be different from what they've been for thousands of years. Something new is going to happen. We're going to have a different kind of people. That's the only way we're going to have a different kind of order. And a nationalist theory should not be that kind of a theory. It should be an empiricist theory, meaning that it should be beginning with observing what are the constraints, what is possible and what's not possible. So within that context, you were already pushing on this, and I completely agree with the suggestion. India has 2,000 distinct languages, mm-hmm. and in a country or a continent, this which is really what India kind of is. There's no way in the world that every single language that has a few million people and its own tradition, its own religious traditions, its own historical inheritance, there is no possibility that every single such people can be given an independent state, because if I mean, look, Scotland is a particularly good example just because we know a lot about it. And I was a few, I don't know how, 15 years ago or something. I went to a conference in Scotland and spent a couple of weeks there with my wife. And I came in. Scottish independence was like the greatest thing. I saw Braveheart, and I was like, yeah, the Scots, those English, And after a couple of weeks, in which I made it my business to talk to everybody that I could find. There were intellectuals, and there were cab drivers, and people who owned restaurants, and
cab drivers are always the best people to talk to in these places.
Once I started, really stopping, like students on the street, and asking them what they thought about Scottish independence, I came up with a very, very clear view that there's absolutely no point in Scottish independence, because most of the people I spoke to were in favor of it. But when I asked them, isn't it going to be difficult? Such a such a small country, not just with England, but with the EU as neighbors, and they also know Scotland will join the EU, obviously. And as soon as I understood that they weren't talking about independent Scotland, Scottish independence was for most of the people I met, it was also a euphemism. It was a euphemism for we're going to become part of the European Union. And
it wasn't sovereignty.
No, they weren't. Yeah. They didn't know about or care about. And I don't, like my sample was obviously skewed. And but look, if we're going to be non-utopian about this, self-reliance, militarily, economically, culturally, religiously, which is what the Americans were reaching for with independence. By the way, the term independence comes to us from the 30 Years' War. The idea that a country declares itself independent took hold at the beginning of the at the beginning of the Reformation. We see England, for example, but the term independence is from the mid 1600s, and the concept, which is really it's really a biblical concept. It's really going back to the Mosaic Law, which says that ancient Israel has to have a king from among its people and prophets from among its people and its own laws and its own borders. Doing this is not something it's not something that you can do easily. Gaining independence is difficult. Maintaining independence is extremely difficult. And in order to do it, you need to have both a population that's very mobilized, that considers it to be among the most important things in life is to be leading a nation that is not being dictated to by neighboring nations or empires. And beyond that, beyond being motivated, there are practical. You have to be able to put together an army. You have to be able to bring allies to bear. You have to be able to build yourself economically and militarily enough to be able to do it. The Kurds are, for this, unfortunately, a really good example. 30 million people. In theory, you'd be hard pressed to find another people that deserves independence more than the Kurds do. They have their own language, they have their own history going back 2,000 years, and oppressed by Turkey and Iran, and it really an admirable people that deserve independence. And by the way, I think it was shocking the way that George W. Bush abandoned them, like after they fought with the Americans, and then wouldn't, when the the moment came for them to assert themselves against ISIS and Shiite militias and the the crazy central government in Iraq, Bush wouldn't sell them tanks. He wouldn't allow them to have helicopter gunships. There was nothing that you needed to gain independence turned out to be available. Mm-hmm. The Americans are globalist Americans. Led them down the garden path, allowed them to fight and die. They thought they were fighting for independence, and then it turned out that the Americans wouldn't support it. They were simply betrayed. But if we're looking at this from a theoretical perspective, we're asking like what are the constraints on an order of independent nations? Well, the first constraint is if you're not strong enough and capable enough to assert your independence and keep it and maintain it, then you can't talk about like some kind of like abstract right to independence. Independence first and foremost depends on your being able to seize it, to cause it to happen in reality. And
that's such an interesting. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's just an interesting point because throughout the 20th century, the let's say the Foucaultian rhetorical frame, the word game that the left would play, would be self-determination. Right? No, we're okay with. We will not call it nationalist. We will not call it nation state. But we are okay with a order of self-determination, of course. Caveat, 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 underneath this broad umbrella of this world order that we are creating through post-war institutions and other meddling abroad. And I think that's the left side of this. And what you're really pointing at with the virtue of nationalism is self-government, and how self-government is way different and way more substantial, tangible than self-determination itself.
Well, I think I might be guilty occasionally of using the term self-determination.
We all are,
also.
I think.
But I do agree with you.
But the self-determination to its maximum in the Wilsonian idealist mentality, that turns into the postmodern problem of divide, where you need, as you said, the number one constraint is having the capacity and fortitude to declare that independence, and that's kind of
right.
That crux of self-government.
Right. So let me translate that into maybe a picture that's a little bit simplistic, but I think helpful. Mm-hmm. You're right. You can't, if you were to insist, as it seems like Woodrow Wilson believed in this, insist on a kind of an absolute right to self-determination. Every group that asserts itself and says, we're different from all the other groups, and so we have a right. We have a right to independence. That kind of a right, like many other abstract rights, it sounds nice, but in practice, you cannot give a right of independence to thousands of different peoples. It's not possible. The need to be able to maintain yourself within a certain minimum territory behind defensible borders, with a population that is that wants to be governed mostly, and that is governable, and doesn't instantly split into 100 tribes killing each other. All of these are real world constraints that mean there's never going to be such a thing as 1,000 or 2,000 independent nations. And so in reality, what we're talking about is one world empire or a couple of world empires slugging it out, like in 1984. That's like sort of one possibility. Another possibility is anarchy, where everybody's too weak everybody's so small and so weak that they can't actually defend themselves against something big that comes along, and that's just like another way of getting to empire. If anarchy is the flip side of empire, the moment that you have anarchy and every family and tribe for running their own foreign policy and their own army, you've just created a situation in which empire is going to sweep in and mop the whole thing up. And in between these two, between empire and anarchy, there is this midpoint, which is some kind of a balance among independent nations. And I can't name a number, but it's interesting that there's a biblical and rabbinic tradition regarding the number of nations, where the number of nations is 70. It's not meant to be taken literally, but it's kind of a picture of what does a somewhat stable world of diverse nations look like, and it could be 70 or it could be 170.
70 sounds good.
Yeah,
I'll
70.
go 70.
No, so right. So what does that mean about smaller peoples?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I mean that's a really interesting and important question. So obviously, some people will say, "Oh, nationalism is always evil." Nationalists are always going to want homogeneity, which is, I don't actually believe that. I think every nation is actually internally diverse to one degree or another. Every nation is made up of tribes. But to be sure, there are nations that say, look, this tribe is menacing me. They're allied with our enemies, and let's drive them out. Let's get rid of them. Let's persecute them. That certainly happens plenty in human history. What's interesting is that in practice, when you look at nation states historically, what actually happens in the more successful ones is that they do deals with minorities, especially minorities that are smaller tribes that they can't have their own independence because they're too small, but they can contribute something. So in India, it's the Sikhs are a good example. In Israel, we have a famous. There's a number of examples in Israel, but
you could talk about the Druze.
Right,
you
but
could talk about a ton of different, even inside Judaism itself, the Jews in Israel. Right?
The Jews in Israel have many different tribes, but I was going to take it down the path with the Druze. So the Druze they're one of these many Middle Eastern tribes that have their own religion. People aren't so familiar with this, but Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are not the only Middle Eastern religions. There are many more, and so the Druze are a tribe of maybe a couple of million, you could say, a nation of a couple of million, scattered through Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. In Israel, our Druze population is coming close to about 200,000, and the Druze, since the 1950s, early on made the decision they want to serve in the Israeli army. And there's these wonderful pictures from the 1950s of Druze units that have a Druze flag. The Druze have their own flag, and they added a Star of David to it, representing their alliance with the Jews, and they've been really brothers to the Jews in Israel. They're a small nation, but they serve loyalty as brothers, and they're treated as brothers. Israelis are very, very emotional about it. And just to give you a sense, Israel is the state of the Jewish people, but in the last few months, when the Druze in southern Syria were threatened, there's actually been multiple instances recently since Giuliani took over of killings and attacks on Druze communities, and Israel has stepped in to defend the Druze, and this is in part because of our alliance with the Druze in Israel. These are their, these are literally their family relations, and we feel that we owe our Druze community to help them where we can. But in part, it's part of the political dynamic of nation states, that nation states need and want to have allies, and having arming, assisting the Druze in southern Syria is it's good politics. We want to be close to other peoples. So I think that this is universally true. That of course, we're always told that nationalism causes hate. In my book, I agree that there are plenty of nationalists who hate the question is whether imperialists hate more than nationalists or not. And let's just leave it at imperialists hate at least as much as nationalists do. And so this kind of myth of the hateful, bigoted nationalist, it prevents us from seeing that sure, there are hateful nationalists, and there are also nationalists who love other nations, who feel a loyalty to minority nations that have helped them with their national project, or to allied nations, or sometimes just to nations, someplace else that you admire. Visiting India, it is absolutely astonishing to see the depth of the love for Jews that you find among Hindus, and you can ask, like, what is it that this is about? Why is it happening? But it's a fact. It is a fact that people love the Kurds and get attached to their cause. I actually love England, despite what my momentary weakness because of Braveheart. Yeah. I love England.
I want England to be great again as well, right?
I do. Yeah. I do. I really do. I mean, what is this about? In part, I feel close to the English because they care historically they cared so much about the Old Testament, and going back to Alfred the Great, their laws are based in Old Testament, and I love that. It also affects the way they think, but part of it is just admiration. A country that for 300 or 400 years succeeded, every single generation in having, several of the most important, scientists and philosophers and explorers and conquerors in the world. It's just a people that you can't help having. I can't help having my breath taken away when I study the British history. And I hope to see them come back. And I personally feel the loss when I see what's happening there, and I feel like they're losing their country.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I think we have pay extra attention to and are super mad about laws such as you can't pray within 60 meters, just quietly pray, of an abortion clinic, or the disparate sentencing that now straight white men are getting in that country, all that stuff. Druze, on the final point on the Druze, if you want a YouTube rabbit hole to go down after you finish watching this video, this interview, check it out. I had the pleasure of dining with the Druze in Haifa when I was in Israel. Just fascinating religious practices, phenomenal cooks. That was a big plus. And just super interesting the way that the Druze have been incorporated into the Jewish state. And I think you make a great point, right? You need to have the capability to assert this independence, defend that independence, and you want to create allies with other nations, but also allies with other peoples, other minorities who are invested in that project. It's an internal problem as well as an external problem. I want to leave you with this. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, is in an acquisitive mood. He is looking at Greenland. He is looking at Panama. He's looking at mineral rights in the Ukraine. Listen, we elected a real estate man as president. I don't think anyone is surprised that the president is looking at how the land is up there in Greenland, what type of strategic advantage it could provide. to the United States, or the Panama Canal, for that matter, given that the Chinese are rapidly trying to infiltrate the hemisphere. How should we be thinking about acquisition for the United States, for other countries, in this resurgent nationalism that the Western world is really experiencing, even though other places of the world are experiencing it to a degree? I think a lot of the dialogue, a lot of the debate online, or probably in a lot of rooms in this town over Ukraine, is that someone who is very pro-Ukraine says, Russia violated Ukraine's sovereignty, invaded a sovereign country, this, that, and the other thing. That, I think, is true. Russia did encroach on Ukrainian territory. No one can deny that at this point in the war. But how should we think about acquisition, right? What is off limits? What is on limits? Is it right for President Donald Trump to pursue purchasing Greenland or taking that beautiful canal back in Panama?
Well, it's actually a great set of questions. Let me start with another one of these anti-utopian observations. The theory of the universal liberal order. This goes, at least as far back as Immanuel Kant, who argued that in primitive human beings live in a war of all against all, tribes against tribes, and that when they become mature and educated, and enlightened, rational, they grow into rationalism. They stop being children, is what he says. Then they create nation states. They push war to the borders. They agree that within the borders, if I have a problem with you, we go to court. I don't kill you. I don't, organize a posse. I don't, get my tribe to attack your tribe. We go to court. We present our case, each one, and the judge decides, and then we obey the decision of the judge. Okay, and this is a somewhat reasonable description of what happens within a nation when the tribes make peace with one another and say, that's it. From now on, we're going to resolve our differences without bloodshed. So now Kant says, and this is really the basis of the whole European Union and world government concept. He says this is true about nations too, that as soon as nations start to mature and leave childhood behind and become rational, then they'll stop going to war, and they'll go to courts, and there'll be international courts, and those courts will make the decisions, and nations will obey whatever it is the courts say. Okay, so some elements of this are already present in the United Nations, and immediately after World War II. Like I said, it goes really crazy after 1989. But this feeling like that's it, starting a war with your neighbors, taking any of their territory, that's just like inherently evil, and we should have courts and they'll make these decisions, and anybody who's a decent person leading a decent country is going to go to court instead of fighting wars. So what's the problem with this? Well, one of the reasons that this is utopian is because we are learning the hard way that judges and courts are not actually impartial, and they're not actually just. I mean, we hope that they're impartial. We'd like them to be just. We do everything we can to make them impartial and just. But it turns out that when you have international courts, that those, heck, I don't even know why I'm going to international courts. I mean, the courts in the United States, there are certain courts that are they're willing
Whether
to,
it's the ICC or the Fifth District.
right, exactly. They're willing to make the decision on a tribal basis without any concern for what the law is or the Constitution or justice, and the same thing is true. The United Nations was supposed to be, the nations of the world maturely debating. In fact, it's a political arena like every other political arena. If you let the Chinese Communist Party and the Iranians and all sorts of other monstrous regimes to have an equal say. So what do? So they take over the Human Rights Council. They take over the Women's Rights Council. I mean, just it's absurd. It's completely corrupt. And so the idea that if I have an independent nation and we have a problem with our neighbors, we have a terrorism problem, or we have we're fighting about water, or we're fighting about the fact that they're like Turkey. They periodically they will just gather millions of refugees and shove them across the border in order to try to force the Greeks to either shoot them or accept them. I mean, there's all sorts of things that neighboring countries can do to one another for good reasons and evil reasons. And then you want to look for, a court that's going to resolve these things. Well, it turns out that the courts are about power politics too. And if you care about the self-government of your nation and its democracy, then you're not easily going to allow some corrupted court that favors your enemies to be making the decisions about what you're going to do. And I mean, that just cuts in all directions. I mean, courts are not a solution to the problem of violence. The problem of violence is because different nations have different interests, and those interests conflict. And it's a fantasy to think that setting up international courts is going to solve it. Now, the other fantastic aspect about this is that it assumes that borders can be permanent forever, and borders can't be permanent forever. I mean, that's just like some kind of a phantasm. Nations grow in terms of population; they shrink. Their needs change. They become vulnerable to being attacked in certain ways and not others. They have to do things in order to defend themselves. So even a non-aggressive nation, the idea that its borders are going to be the same for the next 2,000 years is, it's simply denying reality. There is no such thing. And so we take a case like Ukraine, for sure. The Russian regime is not in my eyes an admirable regime. And I say that despite the fact that in some ways Putin really is an improvement over many of his predecessors, but it's a dictatorial regime. It's a regime that kills its enemies. I mean, its domestic enemies mercilessly. And in the case of Ukraine, it clearly was going to wipe Ukraine off the map, and didn't do it only because force of arms stopped them. So what are we supposed to do about that? There are people who think that you have to take this to court or something like that, and each side will present its case, and if Ukraine can prove that its borders were violated without just cause, then the Russians can be just ordered to leave. That's an attractive picture, but it's not realistic.
Right.
There's lots of Russians living in eastern Ukraine, and there's this small problem that the Russians have nuclear weapons, and they want their enemies a certain distance away from their borders. the kind of people who say, no, you can't take any of those things into account. You can't take into account the ethnic composition of the territory. You can't take into account the security needs or demands of large powers. This is just, again, it is not realistic.
Right. Pointing out reality makes you a Putin lover is what I've been told for, the past, how many years now? 3 years now?
Yeah, so I suggest not being a Putin lover. And I also suggest that you take seriously the needs and demands of powers that are in a position to hurt you. That doesn't answer the question of what should happen. But I happen to think like as I think President Trump does and many others, that the front in that war has not moved in 2 years, and it reminds us of World War I, of the static warfare, and come on, it's really it's really a horror show, and I if I had a magic wand, I would stop. I would stop the war, and stop it where the border currently is, where the border between the armies are, and be done with it. I understand that for many people, that just sounds like the craziest thing, but I think it's the only realistic thing. The alternative to it is, and this appears to be what President Putin prefers, is to fight it out for another couple of years, and hoping that in the end they break. But the idea that the borders can be frozen forever, that's just a formula for detaching yourself from reality.
And a good way to stay attached to reality is acknowledge what your nation needs, the security it needs to make sure that it can maintain that self-government, to maintain that ability to maintain that often coveted and hard to hold on to independence. So,
well, wait a second.
Who knows? Greenland.
We didn't talk about Greenland.
Yeah.
So let's just give me a sec to talk about Greenland.
Please talk about Greenland. I got time.
You got a few more minutes.
Well,
here?
that's why I was teeing you up for it.
All right,
so go ahead.
Okay.
Ukraine and Greenland, very different things, but people on the left, they would like to equate the two.
Okay, but come on.
Yeah.
No, look, seriously. There's 50,000 people in Greenland. Okay, not 5 million, not 50 million. 50,000 people in Greenland, and I'm not suggesting that the Americans need to invade Greenland and take it over by force, but I think that again a bit of realism, please. Taking over a country that like the Iranian interest in taking over everything from Beirut to Riyadh, which they've been working on for the last 50 years and may continue working on for another 50 years. The idea that you are going to conquer tens of neighboring nations and 100 million people is not similar to the idea of taking over an empty space that has a token population there. These two things are not related to one another. Part of what's not realistic here is that many people think they have this idea that imperialism is about territorial expansion, and human politics is territory is it's a resource like oil is a resource, like food, like water, and people fight over all of these resources. But the imperialistic impulse, the imperial impulse, which we see among the globalists, is not primarily about territory. It's primarily about ruling other peoples. It's about conquering other nations that could be independent, could think differently from you, could do remarkable things in some other direction that you don't want to see. And you feel the need to rule them. That's the primary thing that's going on. And, President Trump may someday come up with a proposal, I don't know, to invade Canada, and if he does, then we can discuss, where did he make a mistake and go from being a nationalist to an imperialist if and when that happens. But as long as we're talking about an almost completely empty territory, I'm not yet ready to give up on him as an exemplary nationalist.
Yoram Hazony, thank you for joining the Signal Sit Down. Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sit Down. Before you go, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review. We not only love your feedback, but it really does help the show. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works. See you next time.